Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike.
This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
History doesn't have to be boring, buttoned up, or inaccessible. And it certainly didn't end in 1945. It belongs to all of us, and we share and add to it every day. Welcome to the History A Go-Go podcast, where I interview interesting guests, cover a motley crew of topics, and it's a place where you can sit, think, and drink all at the same time. I'm your host, Rob Mellon.
We shall be prepared if others wish it. We shall be alert to try to stop it. But we shall also do our part to build a world of peace where the weak are safe and the strong are just. We are not helpless before that task or hopeless of its success. Confident and unafraid, we must labor on, not towards a strategy of annihilation, but towards a strategy of peace.
My guest today is businessman and author Seth David Radwell. He is an internationally known business executive and thought leader in consumer marketing. He holds degrees from Columbia University and Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. Radwell served as president of eScholastic, the digital arm of the global children's publishing and education company. He also served as president of Bookspan Bertelsmann, where he oversaw all editorial and marketing functions for iconic brands such as Book of the Month Club. He is the author of American Schism, How the Two Enlightenments Hold the Secret to Healing Our Nation. And that will be our topic of discussion today. Of the book, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of Bearing the Cross, David Garrow, says, American Schism is a vigorously written, deeply informed intellectual tour de force and a bracing call to nonviolent arms. And we are very pleased to have the respected business executive and award-winning author with us today. Welcome, Seth.
Hi, Rob. It's a pleasure to be with you. Thanks for having me today.
I really appreciate it, and the book is excellent, but dealing with the Enlightenment, which is what you do, of course, it's called American Schism, and you get into the Enlightenment, that had to be a real challenge with all of the political philosophy and the history that you had to dive into.
Absolutely. Well, I probably should point out that I've always been a student of philosophy and history. So I was first introduced to the Enlightenment thinkers way back in college many, many years ago. And the reason why I thought it was important to revisit the Enlightenment is because when I tried to do an assessment of where we were as a country and try to answer the questions of why we were so divided, it led me back to our founding, which really was part of this overall Enlightenment movement. So that's where I started to do research intensely for American Schism.
Seth, it is tradition here to accompany the conversation with a special brew. Today, we have Out of Line West Coast IPA from Rogue Ales of Portland, Oregon. At the very core of Rogue is the idea of getting out of line. That is to say, you don't need to follow the plan laid out in front of you. You don't have to fit in, and you don't have to follow the crowd. Rogue brewed this West Coast IPA as a reminder that there is no limit when you have the courage to stand out. Remember, the best way to enjoy an episode is with one of our featured brews. This is also my time to ask you to subscribe to the podcast. Just hit that subscribe button and get the newest material right away before everyone else. And to the growing legion of listeners and supporters from thousands of cities and towns in more than 80 countries, I have to say thank you. And now I raise my Out of Line West Coast IPA very high. And to the age of reason, may it flood us with the sunlight of truth, and to all those enlightened souls out there, I say cheers. Let's actually start before the Enlightenment, though. What's going on in the Western world before the age of reason?
Well, it's fascinating. So, of course, in the Western world, after the long period of the Middle Ages, which we're just starting to come out of in the 16th century, let's say, the structure of society has really been the same for 1,000 years at that point, which is that it's based on kind of three groupings all over the Western world, which is the nobility, the monarchy, kind of the leaders, usually led by a king or some kind of monarch. and an aristocracy, if you will, which is again nobility and landed gentry. And then you had the clergy was a second key force in almost every country, especially the Catholic Church in places like France and Spain and throughout what was referred to as the Holy Roman Empire, which we can get into. And even the Church of England, of course, in England. And then the third section was the masses, were the people who were the commoners, who were mostly uneducated. And, sometimes you hear the term serfs because they work land mostly. Were prior to the Industrial Revolution here. And so the whole structure of society was based on how you were born. It was a luck of the lottery. Were you born into a noble class? Were you titled? Did you have land? And if you didn't and were born into the regular non-landed class, your best chance, if you were smart, was to study and become part of the clergy, because the clergy tended to have a better life than the masses, who were really miserable. It wasn't fun.
So your book is called American Schism, but as it points out, there was actually a philosophical schism in Europe first.
Yes. So I've read a lot about the Enlightenment for many, many years, but it was only when I discovered Professor Jonathan Israel's framework for thinking about the Enlightenment that I really appreciated the original schism, to your point, that happened in Europe. And of course, the Enlightenment was very complex. There were many movements and ideas, but the Enlighteners had, and of course, the Enlightenment touched on so many categories of things. But when it came to political philosophy, the Enlightenment had a very interesting construction, if you will, or construct. It was called the social contract, which we'll get more into. And it was there in the political philosophy of the Enlightenment where there was this schism, this split between two different views of what fundamentally the social contract was involved with and what it required.
So then what's the main philosophical difference? Because you mentioned there's not just one enlightenment. You have, and these are terms that you use in your book, the moderate enlightenment, the radical enlightenment. What are the differences between those thinkers?
There are many, but to simplify it quickly for your listeners, there are two core differences. The first one is that it was the radicals who believed that the only legitimate form of government in a social contract was a representative democracy, was that the masses needed to have a voice because a social contract required the consent of the governed. And the only way to do that, according to the radicals, was through what today we would call a representative democratic form of government. So that was one key difference. And by contrast, the moderates were very much, most of them, of course, were aristocrats and very educated. And for the moderates, they believed that the social contract was valid, but the only people who could govern were the enlightened like themselves. So in the moderate model, and I can, this became very important in the U.S. for people like John Adams. I can give you names of who, but originally John Locke and Rousseau. In their model, it was the responsibility, it was a privilege, but a responsibility for the educated, for the enlightened, to govern on behalf of everyone. So that was the first key difference. Now, any questions? Are going to go on to the second one?
Go ahead.
Well, the second one is related, but also quite important. It was the radicals, especially the French radicals, who documented for many centuries how there was this collusion. There was this cooperation between the nobility and the church to keep people in line, to oppress the masses. So, having documented this history, and many of the radicals were either atheists or deists. They didn't believe in the power of organized religion. It was the radicals who said, you know what, even if you have faith, that's fine. We have to have a clear line, a wall. Today, what we call a separation between church and state. So that was the radical Enlightenment concept that was so important. Whereas the moderates, once again, very much believe that the church had a role to play. And, there's a great quote by one of my favorite moderates, Voltaire. You may have heard of him, a French moderate. He was famously quoted as saying, "Si Dieu n'existait pas, il faudrait l'inventer," which meant if God didn't exist, we'd have to invent him because we need a way to control the people and give them a moral guidance. So now Voltaire was a very good moderate because he was critical of the church and many of the institutions of the day, the nobility. But nonetheless, the moderates believed that the church had a role to play. Those are the two key differences.
Is it okay if I give you a softball question?
Sure.
Okay. Does objective truth exist?
This is a great one.
Because if it doesn't exist, the Enlightenment, that ship starts to take on water pretty quickly.
Well, that's the thing. So if you went back like 50 years or more, it was pretty much accepted that the Enlightenment really provided the framework for the modern society, for the progress that we've made. But yet, around 50 years ago or so, there was a new movement, which today is called Post-Modernism, is a structure of thinking that affected every part of the humanities that really discounts the Enlightenment and says that, there's no such thing as objective truth, that everything is relative. So that's why in the book, I pose this question, because I think it's very important. Does objective truth exist, or the postmodernists right that there is no such thing and everything is relative? But here's the thing, Rob. Let me just give you a couple of stats that prove that I think objective truth does exist and is important for the modern society. I'll give you 3. If you look at any objective measures of prosperity, of thriving of the human species, 200 years ago, life expectancy on the planet was 30 years. Now it's over 70 everywhere on the globe. 200 years ago, 1 in 5 children didn't survive till age 4. Today, almost all do. 200 years ago, 4/5 of the world, the entire globe, lived in tremendous poverty. Today, 1/5 of the world lives in that same level of poverty. So by objective measures, we've made tremendous progress. And a good part of the reason for that, in my view, is the Enlightenment's focus on empirical observation, reason, science, etc. So if you say objective truth doesn't exist, well, then the constitution of knowledge that we've built for hundreds of years and has served us so well, that kind of proves that it does exist.
Was the American Enlightenment just an extension of the European Enlightenment, or was it something entirely unique?
If you look at the Enlightenment by geography, whether it's the German, the British, the Scottish, they all had some interesting things to contribute. But the American Enlightenment had some real uniqueness. I think it was mostly the uniqueness around the political philosophy, because these folks, when they gathered for first the various conventions in the 18th century, they felt that they were learning from a lot of the Enlightenment that happened in Europe, but building the experiment of what a modern government would be. Because they recognized that in Europe, there weren't governments they were governments that were embedded in these very old structures. So the American Enlightenment became kind of a pragmatic example or test of the concepts of the social contract. Now, I say that with one note of caveat, which is that many of the American radicals, especially, spent a good portion of their formative years in Europe, especially in France. And so there was a very strong notion before the French Revolution ended up devolving into such into chaos, that the French and American revolutions were tied, that there was one overall movement that was going to take down the whole structure of society and replace it with one where everyone was created equal. So there was sort of a very strong parallel, in my view, on the political structure between the French and American revolutions and therefore Enlightenments.
Ian, you talked about some of those Americans. Who were some of the moderates and who were some of the radicals? And you covered in your book.
In Europe or in the States?
In the United States.
So in the United States, the best examples, I think, of the moderates were people like John Adams and Alexander Hamilton. John Adams was very much a governor. He was a very influential person in the colony, in the colonial days. And there were colonial leaders who, when things started to get a little bit crazy, were as much concerned about home rule as who was going to rule at home. In other words, these were the leaders of the colonies, and they wanted to organize the grievances against the crown that ultimately led to independence. But they also believed very much in, as I mentioned before, in the enlightened, the educated being the rulers of the government. Now, and by the way, they were both geniuses. I mean, Alexander Hamilton may have been one of the greatest constructors of government structures that ever existed in our country. he was an absolute genius. So I'm not, and Adams as well was one of the most read, he had read all the classical philosophical arguments about political philosophy, including the Enlightenment. But he went back to the Greeks and the Romans. He was a very learned man. Now, what happened is that, so that was the moderate group. And then this radical group there were really three that I talk about in American Schism, the book. You have to start with Thomas Jefferson. And I'll come back to why he was considered such a radical. The other two that I think are really important to talk about are Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Paine. Now, so why were these guys radicals? Because it was these folks who believed that it wasn't just about that everyone, and I'm going to put a caveat on everyone because I want to come back and say who everyone was.
Right. Yeah.
Because at the point it was white men. Every white male, in their view, had an equal chance before the government, had to be equal before the law, had to have a voice in government. And so, the best example of this is if you look at the Declaration of Independence, which was primarily authored by Jefferson, he took what Locke's formulation of the social contract said, that a social contract is an arrangement where people get together to form a civilized society, and they have to give up certain rights, but they can never give up their rights for life, liberty, and property. That was the Lockean model. And Thomas Jefferson very famously replaced the word property with pursuit of happiness. All men are created equal in the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And let's think about that for a second. Why is that so important? It's indicative of this radical Enlightenment move. I would argue the Declaration of Independence is one of the most radical Enlightenment documents ever written. So in Locke's model, property meant that you had the rights to property to guard what was yours. Most people didn't own property. If 90% of the population are the masses, they're not property owners. So by Jefferson, by replacing property with pursuit of happiness, I mean, we take it for granted, but think about that. Everyone has a right to pursue happiness. Think about how broad that is. It was a genius move by Jefferson. By the way, there are Jeffersonian scholars, of course, who are much more educated on this than I am. So that I've read many of them. But some people believe that Jefferson also wanted to not use property because the fear was that the property would focus on slavery. And there are many Jeffersonian scholars believe that ultimately Jefferson, as well as all the framers and founders of our country, knew that slavery was the ultimate contradiction and that eventually it had to go away. The question was, how and when. So that's a whole topic and part of the book. But nonetheless, I think this radical notion is very important. Now, Thomas Paine, he was one of the most important voices in convincing the people that a democratic form of government was fundamental and the crown had no right to do what it was doing. There was a pamphlet that he wrote, many of your listeners may know this, called Common Sense, which became a very important, influential pamphlet that was read by literate people all over the colonies. Benjamin Franklin was an incredible case in and of himself because he was a self-made man. And in my view, one of the most unsung heroes of our country. I think we could go on and on about his contributions, but he very much believed in the radical notion of representative government and equality before the law.
It's interesting that you bring up happiness, and it almost seems like in the Declaration of Independence, it's so generally stated, it's almost like a throw-in, but it's absolutely essential to Enlightenment thought. You're not working, like all of your labor and your pursuits and efforts are not directed toward a king or a church. They're directed towards yourself and your personal happiness. So without that, the Enlightenment doesn't work either.
You're absolutely right, Rob. I think your point's so important because, when I try to explain to young students who I speak to often about why the Declaration of Independence as our credo is such an incredible thing, and what a radical departure, to your point, from history, where people worked to be faithful to the church and have a better life later in the next life, and to work for the nobleman or the king. And so this whole notion that you had a right to pursue happiness was fundamental, and it very much came out of the Enlightenment. There was a great set of Enlightenment thinkers in France, Denis Diderot and others, who described how, in many different areas, how human beings had the incredible gift of observation and reason, that could create a value. That, the value wasn't only based on land, but you could actually create things and do things and pursue a life. I mean, that whole notion that value wasn't only tied to gold and land, but that you could build something by solving a problem. That's why, to me, the Enlightenment is so important.
I think one of the biggest mistakes we make in our political discourse today, and both sides use it, whether you're on the more conservative side or the liberal side, interpreting what the founding fathers wanted or believed.
Right.
And you bring it up in the book. It's just one of the mistakes we make, as if the founding fathers are a monolith and they have this single vision for America, which absolutely was not the case.
Absolutely. That's right. I mean, in fact, there was such different views of what should happen. There were certainly big ones based on geography. I mean, the Southern leaders had a very different view than the North, although in the North, slavery wasn't abolished in some cases till later. But they all had very different views. There were many different views about how, in fact, the famous Constitutional Convention of 1787, that's when the framers got together to codify a blueprint for the Declaration. And one of the things I do in the book, American Schism, is describe how in that 11-year period from 1776 to 1787, the pendulum swung from this radical notion to a much more moderate one. And I describe it in detail because and it's so important for two reasons. The first is it's important because that pendulum swing back and forth would end up becoming a pattern that happens very often in our history. In fact, the book describes 5 discrete episodes of our history where there was this pendulum swing. But the other reason why it's important is because it provides the tension between the two Enlightenment forces. And one way to think about it that's a little simple. So 1776, the spirit of 76 was about ideals, declaring independence from Britain, the notion that we could be our own nation, promise. It was a wonderfully idealistic period. So then we fight this war. It's a couple of years later, and now all of a sudden we got a lot of practical problems. How are we going to pay for the war? As a young country, we needed a foreign policy. How are we going to do? How was 13 colonies going to have a foreign policy? We needed allies. So how are we going to regulate trade? So all of a sudden, there's this huge set of problems that have to be resolved, much more practical concerns than the idealism of the period of 1776. So the people who step up and know how to solve problems, guess what? Well, they educated who were rulers. I mean, Alexander Hamilton steps in and says, we can solve all these problems, et cetera. Now, why is this so ironic? Well, think about it. 2 of the most important grievances that the colonists had against the crown, the central power, were the crown's ability to tax and then the British use of standing armies, like a military force to patrol. So in 1776, those were 2 leading reasons why we declared independence. And fast forward 11 years, in 1787, we give a central power, the federal government, the power to tax and to raise an army. How did that happen? It wasn't lost on the colonists that this was an incredible backward movement. Why were we doing this? And therefore, there were many people against this notion of a strong central government. It was very much counter to what Jefferson wanted in his decentralized radical structure. So the point of it is that, the Federalist Papers, which became the marketing document for the Constitution, is one of the most important political treaties ever written because, to my mind, it helps balance. It shows the balance between the aspects of our governmental structure that are radical and those that are moderate. And Madison, of course, is how to balance them. So, for example, the Constitution said we have a representative house which is a chamber based on representation, which is a very radical idea. But we also have a Senate, which is, where they weren't elected, the Senate. And we have a strong executive like a king, which was more of a moderate notion. So there are these 2 forces that are underlying our form of government in the Constitution, and they're trying to be balanced. And Madison was, by the way, key in striking that balance. It's interesting also from a personal point of view, because, at that point, by 1787, Jefferson is away in France as ambassador. And Benjamin Franklin, another radical, is very old and sick. He's not very well. So he's probably not at his best. And Thomas Paine isn't even in the room.
Right.
So Jefferson is like sending ideas over to Madison, and Madison was kind of the one who was able to bridge the gap. Another thing I think is so important is we had this ideal of 1776, and to get to a workable framework, a blueprint, we had to make a lot of compromises, which I sometimes, Rob, I wish people today would say, you know what, the only way this works is if we compromise.
Right.
No one's going to get exactly what they want. That's the real message of the Constitution. It was very flawed in many ways, but it got us to the next point.
When you talk about founding contradictions, and you mention the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, those should be congruent. There are founding documents.
Yes.
But if you consider some of the great debates in our political history, say the Lincoln-Douglas debates,
yes,
Lincoln focuses on the Declaration and the principles of the Declaration. Douglas focuses on the Constitution. So it seems almost, even from our founding documents, there's a little bit of a schism.
Oh, it's completely. I mean, look, the Declaration to me is the credo, the beliefs, the why we exist. It's the raison d'être, to use a French word. And then the Constitution is supposed to be a blueprint for how to operate. So by definition, one is idealistic and one is very pragmatic. Now, that being said, there are tremendous contradictions between them. And, the brilliance of Lincoln, which in my mind of why he was one of the greatest leaders the world has ever seen, is because he recognized the contradiction. And, the notion of perfecting the Union in his second inaugural address was that he recognized that, look, we have this promise, which, of course, Martin Luther King goes back to. We have this promise in this declaration, and the Constitution is a way of operationalizing it, to use a term today. But the framers were smart. They said, you know what? We're going to make this malleable, changeable, because it's going to have to evolve with the times. And so we have to fix the Constitution to make it better reflect the scope and promise of the Declaration. And so, Lincoln really got that. And it was Lincoln, I think, who his legacy was that he made Americans recognize, is that the Declaration is really what we hold in common. It's part of our credo. We can argue about how to implement it, but if there is an American value system, a hierarchy of values, and I believe there is, and we can come back to this, Rob, because I think having a shared value system is part of the way out of this dilemma that we're in. But that shared value system, to me, is based on the credo and the Declaration and the model of meritocracy that we've built over our history. And they're very important for moving forward. So, but there's no question there was a tremendous set of contradictions, if you will, between the Declaration and the Constitution.
So there are pushbacks to this type of philosophy. Is the Second Great Awakening part of that pushback against reason and scientific discovery and so forth?
Yes.
Especially for individuals who don't have that political power, who've been shut out from the Enlightenment and positions of power. Absolutely.
I mean, so as the book describes, in addition to these two philosophies of political structure, the radical and modern Enlightenment, there was also another force that entered that always was very important in America, which is a set of forces that reject the Enlightenment thinking or are much more faith-based. And I call it in the book the Counter-Enlightenment. And the Second Great Awakening was the first time that it really became a huge wave after our founding. There had been a previous First Great Awakening before we were formed as a country, but it brought complexities. First of all, it brought wonderful aspects to it, which I can get into, but it also brought the notion of rejecting some of the Enlightenment beliefs. And that Counter-Enlightenment set of forces would be with us for our whole history since. For example, what happened is that the colonists who were increasingly grieved and behind the American Revolution, if you fast forward 15 years, their lives didn't improve that much. There was a recession. They were still working hard. There was famously, rebellions like Daniel Shay's rebellion. And so I think the faith movement really brought people together and was very important for the masses in the States to establish faith as a real part of daily life. It also was very important for a couple of reasons. One of them was that it brought the voice of women into the dialogue. Women had very much not been involved in the revolutionary period. But what happened in the Second Great Awakening is that it was the women who often went to gatherings and understood and started developing a voice. And many of those women, by the way, went on to argue for abolition, became strong abolitionists. They also were very much a force for temperance because they were tired of their husbands getting drunk and beating them up. There were interesting forces that started to play out from this Second Great Awakening. As I describe in the book, the founding period was probably the most secular period we've ever had in our country. Our founders were famously secular. Even those that were moderate very much kept religion to the side, whereas after the Second Great Awakening, religion's always been a theme.
Why do strong religious viewpoints of those faith movements, patriotism, and populism often get all tangled together?
Yeah, this is kind of one of the fundamental things I address in the book, and it's really important. There's a famous quote of Charles de Gaulle that basically says, patriotism is when you recognize that you and your country people have a lot in common, and your love for them is great. Nationalism is when your hate, your dislike of them overwhelms that. You find differences that are larger than the commonalities, or you have points that make it so that people dislike foreigners more than they like their countrymen. My point being is that, when religion has a voice that starts entering into the governing of the state, it violates this radical Enlightenment principle of a separation. So I think that the church and faith is very important in our daily lives. But if it gets aligned with a political factor that's governing, or if political leaders use faith as an argument for their policies, that's when it becomes potentially a conflict. And I think that's what's happened a lot in many periods of our country, including the last couple of decades.
If you look at our modern election system, schism is almost necessary part of it. I'll give you an example. I actually ran for Congress. Now, this is a while ago. So I was like inside the system. I could kind of see how it worked. And what I figured out was none of them were really interested in solving problems because they were all used as wedges.
Right.
So, for example, immigration. We had an immigration law that was passed in the 80s. Of course, it needs to be updated. But they did do something in the 1980s. Nothing significant or substantive have happened since then. And I don't think they want to solve it because it's one of those wedge issues that can be used in elections, and elections become the primary concern of the country, not governing, but the election itself.
Yes.
And there's this whole apparatus behind the elections of people who make tremendous amounts of money. It's a whole industry in and of itself. Do you think the Enlightenment thinkers thought of those types of situations? Maybe Hamilton, but did they think there would be this level of disagreement and the political system would overtake the governing of the system, I guess?
Well, first of all, Rob, let me say, I believe you're exactly right. In fact, the third part of American Schism, the book, is about how to move forward. It's a plan to move ahead. And in that part, I argue that the political industry is entirely broken, and that the focus is really, and the money and the time is spent on getting reelected as opposed to problem solving, which is one of our fundamental dilemmas. I point you to Washington's farewell address, in which he famously, because it was already happening by the time Washington was leaving, what happened was the schism that we described, that we talk so much about, the Democratic Republicans of Jefferson and the Federalists of Hamilton, they became very bitter. In some ways, it was like it is now. It became extremely bitter and personal. And Washington recognized how counterproductive this was. And in his farewell address, he warns that be careful of political parties. If political parties become more dominant than our common credo to the nation, we're really in trouble. And in the book, I describe how that's what's happened, basically. I think that both the Democratic and Republican parties, they together have a monopoly on the system. We need a multi-party system. We need ranked choice voting. I mean, I can get into more of the things I put forth as solutions in American Schism, and they're very pragmatic, by the way. Some of them are very pragmatic, because I don't think that we're currently on the right path. Let me just say one more thing on this. I think your use of the example of immigration was very wise. A couple of years, not that long ago, I think it was 8 years ago or so, we had a bipartisan proposal that passed the House on this new immigration framework. And it was definitely not perfect. There were people on the right who were very upset. There were people on the left who were very upset because it had quotas or things like quotas. People on the right were upset because it had a pathway to citizenship for dreamers. But the point is, we had a framework that solved many problems. It was a compromise. Now, 5 years later, after screaming about build walls and open borders, we're much further away from a solution. we still have the same problems, but we had this broad solution. So I think it's an example again about how unless we're going to compromise, we're just going to be blowing air at each other.
In regards to the schism itself, I'd like to talk about manifest destiny and the period of expansion in the United States. In comparison to people who live in small island nations, they might have to figure out their issues or political problems with their neighbors. They have no place else to go. That has not been the case in American history.
Right.
So does the abundance of land and avenues of opportunity actually contribute to the schism? U.S. history is filled with cases where groups who had disagreements or political controversy just simply picked up and moved west. And in some cases, the utopian societies tried to separate from society completely. So does the period of expansion actually make the schism inevitable?
Well, there's no question that force, which is sometimes called manifest destiny, this notion that emerged by the end of the founding period, that the country could expand because there was land. I think it's probably best represented by the Louisiana Purchase under Jefferson that I think doubled or more than doubled the size of the country. Yes, so there was this notion all through the 19th century that we were going to manifest destiny, expand across to the sea. And that provided a way, which was also supported by the government, to start new things. And if you didn't like where you were, as opposed to trying to change your community, you could start anew. And that was a huge force. Now, I will also say that, again, it wasn't as if this ticket or this opportunity to start anew was granted for everyone. We still had slavery. Of course, Native Americans were continually pushed, over. So like many things, there is a whole revisionist school about what that's about. And there are many ways to view it, but I think, again, history could be a guide if we study and understand it. But there's no question that, to your question, that the expansion ended up creating, let out the steam, if you will. When there was tension between these different forces, the steam could escape. It was a valve by pushing westward.
Populism and Enlightenment thought don't always align very well. Are demagogues, and we've had several in history, not only in American history, but in world history, are they always populists? And how do they use this schism to gain political power?
Well, demagogues, I think, over history there have been different tactics they've used and tools. And one of the tools, populism is an interesting word because, as I discuss in the book, what does populism really mean? And I distinguish between two forms of populism. In one sense, bottom-up populism, where people organize to have a greater voice in government, is a very positive thing. It happened very much in the Jacksonian era, and then afterward, it happened in the 19th century in a big way in the creation of the Populist Party, which was a bottom-up movement that came out of the Farmers Alliance for people to solve problems and get involved. Okay, so bottom-up populism is a very good thing, in my view, personally. Now, populism also has another connotation. The notion when political actors use themes related to a populism to curry favor, to get support, despite that their actions might not follow those. So that's how we've come to see, what does populism mean? So I would ask you, Rob, terms can be difficult. I think bottom-up populism, where more people become enfranchised and get involved in their communities, is a very good thing. But I'm also very skeptical when leaders, political candidates or leaders, use populist and nativist themes to either scare or as political tools, as rhetorical tools. I think that, and I have to say, I think Trump was a master at it, whether you're conservative or liberal. In terms of what we've seen in the last couple of years, we've seen the use of populism and nativism has been tremendously powerful levers to create fear and help Trump build loyalty in his base, which is quite active still today. And that also is a situation that is not just happening in the U.S., it's happening all over the world.
The interesting thing about the premise of the book, American Schism, is that it's a problem that needs to be fixed, that we have to close that chasm that we currently have.
Yes.
But as we've discussed today, there's people who can gain political power because of the schism. There's people who gain more voters,
right,
or gain more viewers, say Fox News or even MSNBC, using the schism itself or the chasm to curry favor, as you mentioned.
Yes.
So maybe in this idea, part of the problem is not everybody wants to close the chasm or fix the schism.
No, in fact, there are many actors that parts of society that don't, especially when they're making money from this. So, I argue in the book, in the third part, that our media model is broken because it's based on getting clicks and whatever gets you the most impulse reaction is what gets the loudest voice. And that's not necessarily good for solving problems. I mean, I probably should go back, Rob, as you may know, I'm a big believer. I'm a business person. I built my whole career in the private sector, and I built many great brands. My belief is that the political industry is so broken that private sector leaders who know how to solve problems, as opposed to, we need to get more involved. That in other words, we've got to, not all political actors are bad. Some public service are wonderful.
Right, of course.
And I don't mean to condemn them all, but too much time and energy is spent, to your point, about getting reelected as opposed to solving problems. Now, it's one of the reasons I argue for term limits. I used to be against term limits. I think there are pros and cons. For example, people who stay in office get to be better legislators. They learn more. They're more effective. But I argue in the book that the cons of term limits, of not having term limits, are actually much worse. That it perpetuates cronyism and this notion of staying in office for life, which was not the intent of the founders. And so I think term limits is one way that we'll get out of this.
You mentioned Donald Trump, and similar to you in the sense that he grew up in the business environment, he knew how to build a brand. There's no question about that. Whatever you think about Donald Trump, he definitely knows how to build a brand. How did he use those disagreements, those philosophical differences, and that schism to gain his personal political power?
I think you're right. From a marketing point of view, brand building, he's very shrewd. And I think he recognized an incredible thing that would happen. He recognized that the establishment, both parties, the Democrats and Republicans, had shown disdain for white working class Americans for too long. Whether it was, Hillary Clinton's deplorables or Mitt Romney's takers, both sides of the political aisle, which were dominated by cities on the coasts, kind of had shown disdain for much of America. And there are reasons why that happened, by the way. We could talk. I talk about it to some degree, but we can go into it. But the bottom line is Trump was able to see that, and how that there was this building rage for for decades, really, as our economic model of neo-capitalism or our neo-globalist model was in fact leaving a lot of Americans behind. So, if you look in small towns and rural areas, they were devastated by these moves of capital to other parts of the globe. And yes, maybe it made the world better off overall, but there were a lot of losers. And our political system stopped really caring about them. And the funny part is the people who used to care about them used to be more of the Democratic Party. And up until someone for years, Bob Reich was writing about this, how we're leaving the skills behind. We're not. But it's ironic that it was Trump who was now a Republican and getting these labels, right? He was able to figure out how much of this working class American angst was related to also rage about the political establishment not listening to them. So what Trump was able to do is get a lot of people who sat out the last elections to come back in. And in that way, one could make the case that he's done a wonderful thing by bringing more people back into the discussion. To your point, I think his brilliance was to recognize that all this anger and built up resentment at the political class could be used to create a new political movement.
Essential to the Enlightenment is equality, and meritocracy is key to the conclusion of your book and the importance of a true meritocracy. I think part of the problem currently is a misinterpretation of what a meritocracy actually is and how to achieve it. Too many people believe the way to balance the historical scales is to take from some groups who have benefited from the nature of our society for decades and give those gains to those people who have been historically excluded. The problem with that is that creates a dynamic and a tremendous amount of fear in those individuals that you were just talking about. They are absolutely petrified that they or their children will have little opportunity in the future. We're going to have a real challenge fixing our problems and even our racial divide in an environment of such uncertainty and fear.
Well, I think this is a big topic in the book. A core way to think about it is to understand this, is to think about the difference between equality of opportunity versus equality of outcomes. In other words, if we're using government to make everyone equal, that's not my sense of what meritocracy is about, trying to do better at giving everyone a chance to have opportunity. And I talk about this a lot in the book because it's important. And I think it goes back to John Rawls, who was one of the great philosophers, if you will. He wrote A Theory of Justice, I think, in the 70s. I mean, he lays this out. And I think what we need to do is differentiate between those two types of equality and figure out how to get back to equality of opportunity to make our meritocracy better as opposed to giving up on it.
Well, my last question for you, actually, I'm going to use a quote that you have in the book, Isaac Newton's third law of physics. For every force in nature, there's an equal and opposite reaction or counterforce. So does that mean the American schism is inevitable and will be here forever?
It certainly seems that we have cycled back and forth. There has been this pendulum-like swing. But I think over the overall arc of history, to use a great quote from someone more inspirational than I, it tends to move towards a more just society. I think over time, no one could argue that despite all of our imperfections in terms of our government and in terms of our meritocracy, we still probably have the best, most successful form of self-government in the history of the world. And we still have probably also the best meritocracy. It's for years why America was the beacon of hope. People wanted to come here. But at the same time, neither are perfect. We have corruption in government. Not everyone has equality of opportunity. Certainly, African Americans haven't for quite a while, and even today. We have to improve on the track record we've been on, and it hasn't been perfect. So that's where I think that, it goes back to you view the glass as half full or half empty. And I think that those on the left who want to take apart or explode our structures because they haven't been progressive enough are very dangerous. And those on the right who deny truth are also very dangerous. So I believe that the extremes are not helpful. I think that's why I wrote the book, Rob, and that's why I think that there's a balance here between the need for change and progressiveness, but also the importance of our institutions, the American experiments background, history, what we've been through. So, they're both equally important and need to be balanced.
Well, thank you very much, Seth. The book is excellent, by the way, and I really enjoyed the conversation. That was a lot of fun.
It was. I'm happy to come back, and I hope your listeners will take a look at American Schism. Wherever books are sold, they can find it.
Absolutely. They can find it in the description below, too. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a wonderful one.
I would like to thank my guest once again today, accomplished business executive and author Seth David Radwell. And if you would like to get his new book, American Schism, How Two Enlightenments Hold the Secret to Healing Our Nation, simply click on the link in the description below. Our featured brew was Out of Line West Coast IPA from Rogue Ales of Portland, Oregon. If you like the talk today, please share this episode with a friend. And once again, subscribe to the podcast. If you're looking for more information on guests and books, like the History of Go-Go Facebook page. The music was provided by the talented North Carolina band Bones Fork. And if you'd like to check out their brand new album, Beautiful Circle, just click on their link. It's in the description below as well. Finally, to the growing list of listeners from more than 80 countries from around the world, whether you're from Davis, California, or Mesa, Arizona, or from Singapore or Seoul, South Korea, I have to say thank you. There are many more great episodes on the way. So join us again next time when we talk, think, and drink on History of Go-Go.
When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitled them.
Decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.